listening to Awake in Relationship, a podcast about intimacy, community, and culture in a time of great change, with Silas Rose.
Hello, dear listener. My name is Silas Rose, and you're tuned into Awake in Relationship. I think it's fair to say that in the past couple of years, our lives have been disrupted in ways that we really never thought possible. While it seems the worst of the pandemic is behind us, our world has seamlessly transitioned onto a major land war in Europe. So if you're feeling a bit trepidatious or uncertain about the future right now, you're not alone. I've had quite a few conversations with people lately really noticing this kind of background anxiety. Fear feels very personal. We carry it in our bodies. It not only affects our neurobiology, it shapes our behavior, in particular, our worldview. We all have unique strategies, which we developed pretty early in life, for dealing with fear. We might seek out some kind of distraction or dissociate through drugs, alcohol, or overwork, or maybe we just freeze, like a deer in the headlights. I feel like we're living in a time when all the unconscious patterns that we create to avoid fear are coming to the surface, both individually and collectively. It's like fear is the gatekeeper to the sustainable, compassionate, sane society we need to create. Fear often shows up in transition times when things are most fluid and uncertain. There's often an illusory quality to our fearful thoughts, hence the acronym used in self-help circles, false evidence appearing as real. Of course, some threats are very real, and the fear is there to wake us up. But how do you tell the difference between illusory fear and awake fear? In this episode of Awake in Relationship, I speak with returning guest Susan Gillis Chapman, author of the 5 Keys of Mindful Communication, about turning towards fear and using the moments when we're most afraid as stepping stones to fearless love. We also talk about the 3 kinds of fear that show up in times of transition, when the reference points of life seem to be falling apart, and how to use mindfulness to cultivate the inner resources of bravery, confidence, and self-compassion. I should mention that if you are struggling with a lot of anxiety and fear right now, the big takeaway from this episode is don't feel like you have to go it alone. Fear's biggest stick is isolation. So I encourage you to please share your experience with an empathetic person. That can be a therapist or a good friend. There's something really powerful about sharing our vulnerability and inner experience. It's a way we create connection. Susan, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Silas. I'm very happy to be back with you.
Yeah, it's been a while. For those that perhaps haven't tuned into our previous conversations, it might be helpful just to introduce yourself and maybe talk a little bit about what you've been working on in the past few months.
Well, introducing myself is actually probably part of our dialogue because I think this is really very much a work in progress. Just in terms of our conversations, you know, when I published the book 5 Keys to Mindful Communication, which was about 10 years ago, I had just emerged from 9 years living at a Buddhist monastery. And so that was like the beginning of a, transformative process for me. And I think some of our previous conversations have been sort of stepping stones along the way. So generally speaking, I'm here living in the Burnaby area outside of Vancouver. I'm happily married 34 years, and my son lives in China, and he's happily married. And teaching there. And for almost 50 years, maybe 48 years, I've been practicing Buddhist mindfulness meditation and loving kindness and other Buddhist practices with quite a few teachers. And that's very much influencing the conversation we'll have today, I think.
So I've been working on this new book project, which is about Bardo. And it's kind of a really unique offering because I don't know how you categorize on the audience you're aiming to reach. I would assume it's kind of people that are interested in spirituality or personal development. And in that regard, many books on the market are really kind of focused on results, whereas you are really focusing on the journey, the transition. Why is it important to focus on transitions right now?
Well, again, when I began practicing Buddhism and meditation in 1974, I was in a bardo at that time. My brother had just died in a car accident. I, hitchhiked from Vancouver to Colorado, looking for guidance. And the teacher that I found, Trungpa Rinpoche, introduced the idea of the spiritual warrior as a practice of turning toward fear and relating to groundlessness, and one of his more famous students is Pema Chodron, who picked up that same theme. And if you look, or if any of the readers, the audience is listening, if you are familiar with her titles, the wisdom of uncertainty, or relating to uncertainty when things fall apart, etc. So it's very much how I've been trained for the last 48 years, is about making a relationship with things falling apart rather than trying to sew them back together.
So traditionally, bardos kind of relate to the time of death, whereas I think, bardos are always happening in life. But I think what's consistent is it really kind of begins with some kind of shock that kind of rocks our world. Mm-hmm. This tremendous space opens up and uncertainty, and that's really where the fear comes in. Are there certain telltale signs for anyone listening that might kind of indicate, hey, actually, I might be in a bardo right now?
Yeah, so one of my goals with this book is to allow the term bardo to become part of our vernacular when we look at certain kinds of transformative changes, or potentially transformative changes that occur in our life. And I think, again, going back to Pema Chodron's book titles, a lot of times people will say things like, suddenly everything is upside down, or I felt like a trap door opened up and I just fell through it. As you said, the definition of a bardo, at least my working definition, is it's not what was expected. It's an unexpected event. And it doesn't have to be hugely traumatic. I mean, we could talk about the larger examples of, your home burning down, or losing your job, or the death of a loved one. All of those are bardos, in my opinion. But we can also I think the invitation is to look back at our lives and see that these gaps in what we call normal are actually the times when we grew and changed and transformed the most. And everything has to do with how we relate to that shock, that fear.
You get quite granular when talking about that fear.
In the traditional teachings on the bardo, there are essentially 3 stages that we go through between death and rebirth. And I know that not everyone believes that this process occurs after death, but nonetheless, the traditional teachings identify these 3 stages. And so in reflecting on that, I realized that these 3 stages somewhat correspond to my experience of 3 kinds of fear. The first fear, which is that shock of wakefulness, That's the shock. I'm just going to use my example. You have cancer, shock. And you have to relate to that. That fear is telling me the truth. It's telling me that there's something I need to do. I can't ignore it, right? So that fear is like a wake-up call into a new reality. Like, I didn't think this was happening. Now it is happening. So it's an alarm clock that wakes me up. So that's really important, that we have a way of relating to that. And I'll get back to that in a minute. The second kind of fear is in Buddhist psychology, it's called ignorance, but a more accurate way of saying it is denial. It's turning away from what is true and trying to fill that gap of wakefulness with some alternative story that diverts our attention away from the truth. And the thing is that we're very, very intelligent in filling that gap with persuasive, believable alternative stories. I call that, in my first book, I call that toxic certainty. And what that particular red zone, I call it, this realm of frozen fear does is really closes any kind of gaps of uncertainty, which makes it seem very appealing. But in fact, what we're doing is we're closing the space in which we can listen to ourselves or deeply listen with critical thinking to others. So we could get back to that also, but so that's frozen fear. And the third kind of fear, which is associated with the kind of stage of the bardo that's just before we're born again into a new body. This has to do with what I call the core fear. It's the basic fear that we've been hiding, that there's something wrong with me. And in terms of the way Trungpa Rinpoche taught, he emphasized that we, all human beings, are basically good. We're basically innocent. Yes, we suffer, and we suffer due to all kinds of mistaken patterns, but our fundamental nature is good. However, if we don't examine the nature of our kind of earliest traumas, which really is the trauma of, being born into or experiencing other people's frozen fear, then it's easy for us to take the blame onto ourselves and say, there's something wrong with me. And if we don't examine that, then that core fear continues to trigger us to shut down. It's almost a feeling of shame, like there's something I should be ashamed of. I'm not exactly sure what, but I know it's there, And so this third kind of fear has a different quality than the other two, in the sense that it's really central to our sense of, I would say, a false identity.
Yeah, sense of self.
Yeah, it's a sense, we've created a sense of self where even we could say defense mechanisms around that without having turned around to see what's really there. So, so this is kind of, you could say this is the journey of the spiritual warrior, or the journey of someone who's willing to let a bardo be transformative, is to relate to all three of those, because all of us have, to some degree or another, all three of those stages that we go through.
If I understand you correctly, would core fear be kind of an existential kind of anxiety?
Yeah, I think that this, again, is like in Western psychology, we might call it an existential crisis. And in Buddhist psychology, we might say it's the fear of the truth that we don't exist. It's like a non-existential crisis. But, the fact that we don't exist doesn't mean that there's nothing happening. It just means that the self that we keep identifying with is actually not accurate, and this is why a bardo can be so incredibly helpful because it shakes up what we think of as normal. And from a conventional point of view, that's distressing. Like, I want things to be normal again. I want to be who I always was and I thought I would continue to be. But actually, a bardo is bringing us home to what is true, which is everything is constantly changing. The thing about a bardo, and I'll say this again from my cancer journey, is that it produces a sudden, abrupt glimpse of the kind of change that's normally gradual. So, like the body I have today is really different than the one I had 2 years ago. And the cancer treatment made it feel like that was a huge, this body transplant, like this huge thing that happened in this series of traumatic kinds of events. But in fact, I'm 2 years older, and we age and we change. So it's really an invitation to take another look at the natural fluidity of our experience. And even one step further, we could say that disruption itself is really good news, because it's only in disruption that we see the gaps, that we see beauty, that we receive love, that we receive wisdom. Those are what I call the ways of nourishing our roots. It's only by interrupting the flow of normal that those things can happen. It's like if you're going for a walk and you keep talking, you don't notice the wildflowers in the meadow. You have to have an interruption in order to experience things as they are. So this is kind of the positive. I'm not saying that the bardo is comfortable or easy, but it's bringing us closer to what's true than our so-called normal conventional sense of going from one solid thing to another.
It's interesting to talk about fear as something that is transformative and ultimately brings us back into alignment with something deeper, which we might call basic goodness, or maybe it's love.
Well, coming back to the topic of love, I feel that, so what I'm doing in the book is I'm actually personifying the word love. Love is central and most important. And I may have said earlier, I can't remember, that the book really is a dialogue between love and fear, or a relationship between love and fear. And in the Bardo teachings, we're told that there's a tremendous opportunity in the Bardo for the loving mother to be reconnected with the lost child. And that's a beautiful, beautiful image that I'm trying to build upon by saying that there's hundreds, thousands of different ways that love manifests when we're in a time of disruption. It's the kindness of strangers. It's someone who points out the wildflowers. But we do need, it's really essential that we find as many ways as possible to bring love into our experience in order to prevent fear from freezing. And so, again, in the Buddhist teachings, there's lots of images of the female Buddha. One image is the female Buddha named Tara, who is a representation of liberation from fear. That's her specialty. So where fear shows up, she arrives and liberates us from fear. And there's all kinds of symbolism in her imagery that represents how she does that. But it's primarily with loving kindness, compassion, wisdom. When it comes to the red zone, which is the hardest, most of us live there a lot of the time, environments in which frozen fear and denial sort of dominate. The female Buddha that shows up in the traditional Buddhist teachings is called Prajnaparamita, and her specialty is recognizing confusion. And that's really extraordinary. Like, how do we recognize our own confusion? We do have a capacity in our mind. We have an ability to do that. And when we meditate, there's something in our mind that wakes us up from the train of thoughts and brings us back to our breath, or brings us back to the present moment. That's symbolized as prajnaparamita. So how do we skillfully interrupt the confusion of toxic certainty and create space for deeply listening and asking ourselves the question, is this really true? Do I really believe this? And that's really important. And one of the things that relates to that as far as mindful communication goes is one of the methods for cultivating prajna is dialogue. It helps a lot to read and study wisdom teachings, but it's also really, really helpful to be in dialogue with someone else, or in a contemplative dialogue with yourself, so that you actually do say, okay, this is what I believe, and then discover that that's not true. So anyway, that's one example of how we liberate from this frozen fear, is by cultivating a questioning, an inquiry. But again, it's got to be loving and compassionate, or else it just triggers our defensive reactions. And in the third part, there is this kind of image again of the loving mother who reconnects with the lost child and brings that lost child home. And that home is the basic goodness, basic innocence. And the way that we do that is, again, we go back into like, where did I get the idea that there's something wrong with me? So, I explored that a lot in my book, The 5 Keys, and I've worked on it in other ways. But it's basically, if one of the messages I'm delivering here comes from a really wonderful teacher of mine, Virginia Hilliker, who said that all children are born compassionate and will absorb the suffering of the parents, but they don't have always the insight or wisdom to understand that it's not their fault. Like they would absorb the blame in order to make the parents not be angry, or they would absorb the unworthiness in order to make a parent feel worthy, but there's this carried misunderstanding that says this is my identity. So the practice of working with that third kind of fear in terms of this loving mother is to have a very affectionate investigation into that. Like, where did that come from? And a lot of that is what we do in therapy. That's what really good psychotherapy is all about, is bringing us back. And in this case, again, it's like imagining that one form or another of loving presence goes with us through the bardo and meets each of these different kinds of fear with some form of compassionate inquiry.
It really feels like the tip of the iceberg is that frozen fear. That's what most of us are kind of working with and we'll recognize. And so much of that is obviously rooted in trauma, and we live in traumatic times. Mm-hmm. So I think that fear is up for a lot of people right now. How can we give ourselves the love and care? How can we learn to relate with fear in a very direct way, in a gentle way?
Well, my understanding so far, or my experience so far, is we cannot be isolated. That, the image I have is what I call a front visualization. In other words, especially in a bardo, when we've had some kind of really shocking, painful experience, we do need to have even one caring person being there for us. We need a circle of care, and we have to be very careful who we hang out with. So I do think there has to be some way of connecting, and it can be a stranger In my case, it was my doctor, just somebody who says, here's the truth. I'm here with you. I see, I feel what you're going through. And so I think it's finding some way of building that circle of kindness for ourselves. And it's really hard to do. I mean, we have to do that ahead of time before something difficult happens. But I think, as you've talked about many times, and you actually are dedicated to this, is we have to find alternatives to disembodied opinion-based exchanges of information that is really, red zone communication on social media. I know there's probably lots of good things that happen on social media, but at the same time, even an encounter with a stranger in the park who pauses and pats your dog can have more nourishing value than the empty calories of an exchange online with somebody who just shares your opinion about something. Do you know what I'm saying? So I do think that the loving kindness, and this is not, by the way, this is not what's presented traditionally in Buddhism, but I believe it's true that we actually need our sense of self-compassion to be ignited by external people. Just one loving friend is all we need, as opposed to 20 friends who can't listen to us.
Perhaps the genesis of that is really developing a sense of vulnerability and willing to kind of share our inner experience.
Yeah, I mean, how many very profound conversations have happened on airplanes with the person sitting next to you that you don't even know their name, So there's just something very human about the need to be held with affection or with encouragement or with presence. And I know that the reason people pay therapists is it's hard to find. You can't just say, look in Craigslist for someone who has presence. But on the other hand, we can say that the space that we need is the space for listening. Somebody who can listen to us, someone that we can trust. So we listen to them. And then in that way, we start listening to ourselves. So, yeah, there are lots of techniques we can use to develop self-compassion, but I really don't want to encourage the listener or myself to continue to just go it alone.
Any genuine path of transformation, I assume many people listening to this podcast are on some kind of spiritual journey, or certainly focusing on growing themselves as individuals and in their work. That fear is a constant companion. Even if we look at the life of the Buddha, the Maras, they're always on his back up until the moment of enlightenment. So there really is no kind of warriorship or real growth without fear. Mm-hmm. What do you think the ultimate reward is of facing that fear?
Well, I don't know if we call it a reward. It's really the opportunity to wake up. And what my teacher, Trungpa Rinpoche, said is there is such a thing as fearlessness. It's just that fearlessness cannot be achieved by turning away from fear. It can only be achieved by going into it fully. And so in that case, I would say, if we were imagining this as the bardo, and if the mother, the loving mother, actually can bring the lost child home, the lost child being our fear, this part of ourselves that's frightened, and home is really reconnecting. We are interdependent. Life is fluid. Everything is about letting go, but also about things being born on the spot. The things that we're afraid of become more illusory as we get to this home. So, the result, you could say, and this isn't something we can experience on the spot, but paradoxically, we can experience some of these glimpses of our own goodness on the spot. Again, you're terrified, you're going for a walk, and then you see that wildflower, and in that moment, you're home. And then the fear reconstructs itself, but maybe it's changed a little bit. Maybe it's softer and less intense. So this constant interruption that occurs with moments of beauty, with moments of love, with moments of wisdom, when we say, oh, I'm wrong. I thought I bought into that, but now I'm realizing it was wrong. I mean, those interruptions are in some ways complete, in those moments, if we were really to see them under the microscope, we're fearless in those moments. It's just the habit of reconstructing ourselves again. So, everything that I'm saying, it has kind of a macro and a micro. The macro sense is ultimately, yes, it's possible to experience fearlessness. That's what the Buddha, experienced with enlightenment. But on a micro level, there are moments of seeing that complete goodness all the time. It's just that we normally overlook them. And this path is really about going into any moment, any interruption, and finding that kind of, drinking in, nourishing ourselves with the affection for our ordinary everyday life, which in some ways is the antidote to this kind of, fear of what will happen next. Because those micro moments of our everyday life, those wildflowers, that's what's true. What we're afraid of is usually some kind of thought. It's not something you can smell and, doesn't have color and taste.
Sounds like you're talking about nowness, which might be a topic for a future podcast.
The word nowness, right? Yeah. So this is, but that is what mindfulness is, isn't it? Mindfulness really is training to come back to the present moment. And when you're in the present moment, there's affection, but there's not necessarily fear. Fear may be a pathway, or it may be a blockage. So this is why I would say the victory story is that love, I was going to say love trumps fear. I'll just say love wins out over fear. Love is bigger than fear. And, if you see enlightened people, they are full of love. They're not full of fear. So love is much bigger than fear. That's the good news.
I so appreciate our conversation, Susan. Thank you. How can people learn more about you and stay in touch?
Well, they could always check my website, susangillischapman.com. I was putting chapters from my book in there, but I've decided to take them out because it's still so dynamic. But I have some information there, and so I'll try and communicate with people through the website.
I so appreciate my conversations with Susan and her gentle wisdom. If you want to learn more about her work, head over to susangillischapman.com. I'll be sure to put some links in the show notes at awakenrelationship.com. While you're there, you can sign up for the newsletter. And I always appreciate hearing from my audience, so if you have any feedback or suggestions for future guests, send me a message to the contact page. I can also be found on Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. If you've been enjoying the show, I'd really appreciate just a quick review on Apple or wherever you listen to podcasts. So thank you during this and for tuning in. Till next time, stay connected.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Awake in Relationship. If you liked what you heard, please click subscribe to get the latest show delivered fresh to your device, or sign up for our newsletter at awakeinrelationship.com. Sharing is caring.